The gun was pressed against Abel Donnelly's temple when Lavinia Boone screamed his name. She screamed it raw and ragged, the sound tearing out of her throat like something that had been locked away and finally broke free of its cage. The evening sky over Redemption, Texas burned orange and red behind her, and the dust from the main street swirled around her boots as she ran, her dark hair coming loose from its pins, her chest heaving with the kind of desperate, animal fear that no woman should ever have to feel for a man she had only known 4 months. 4 months. That was all it had been. 4 months since she had stepped off the stagecoach into this brutal, beautiful corner of the 1878 frontier, and somehow in that short stretch of time, Abel Donnelly had become the thing she could not afford to lose. The man holding the gun was Chester Price, and his name alone was enough to make the blood drain from Lavinia's face. Chester Price, whose dark past stretched back through 3 counties and 2 dead marshals, whose hidden motive for coming to Redemption had been the subject of hushed whispers since the first week Lavinia arrived. Chester Price, who had set a trap so carefully constructed that none of them had seen it until they were already inside it. Abel did not look at Lavinia when she ran toward him. He kept his eyes on Chester, his jaw locked, his hands raised at shoulder height, his body absolutely still. That stillness was the most terrifying thing about the scene, because Lavinia had learned in 4 short months that Abel Donnelly was never still. He was always moving, always working, always reaching for something just beyond his grasp. To see him frozen like that, compliant in a way that was so fundamentally unlike him, told her everything about how serious this was. "Don't," Abel said, his voice pitched low and even, and Lavinia could not tell if he was speaking to Chester or to her. She stopped 6 feet away. Her hands were shaking. The last threads of sunlight caught the tears on her face and turned them gold. Chester laughed, a loose, rattling sound like stones in a tin can, and looked at her over Abel's shoulder. "Well," he said, "now we're all here." And Lavinia thought, with perfect, crystalline clarity, that she had not come all this way, had not survived everything she had survived, had not fallen into something she could not name with a man who could not name it either, to watch it all end in the dirt of a frontier town at the wrong end of a gun. She had not come this far to let him go. 4 months earlier, in early April of 1878, Lavinia Boone had arrived in Redemption, Texas, with $32, a battered leather trunk, and a letter of introduction that was already 3 weeks old by the time the stagecoach deposited her into the heat and the noise of the town's main street. She was 24 years old, and she had left everything behind. She told people she was a schoolteacher looking for a position, which was true enough. The county had posted a notice in a St. Louis newspaper seeking a woman of education and character to take over the schoolhouse in Redemption, following the sudden departure of its previous occupant. What Lavinia did not tell people was why she had been so eager to put nearly 1,000 miles between herself and St. Louis. She did not tell them about the man she had almost married, or the secrets he had been keeping, or the betrayal that had gutted her so thoroughly that she had spent 3 weeks lying in her sister's spare bedroom staring at the ceiling before she found the courage to answer the advertisement. The stagecoach rolled to a stop in front of the general store, and Lavinia stepped down into the dust and the heat and the overwhelming smell of horses and wood smoke and sun-baked earth, and she thought, "This is either the bravest thing I have ever done or the most foolish." It was probably both. The man who met her was not Abel Donnelly. It was Fletcher Holt, the mayor of Redemption, a red-faced man in his 50s who wore his self-importance like a second coat and had the handshake of someone who believed his grip communicated authority. He welcomed her with the practiced warmth of someone who had rehearsed it, showed her to the small house behind the schoolhouse that would serve as her quarters, and gave her a tour of the town that was equal parts genuine pride and thinly veiled sales pitch. Redemption was not a large town, but it had aspirations. It had a main street with a hotel, a general store, a bank, a saloon, and a barber shop. It had a church with a bell tower that was still missing its bell. It had a livery stable run by a man named Silas who never appeared to sleep. It had a marshal's office with a real marshal in it, a lean, weathered man named Crane who listened more than he spoke. And it had, on the eastern edge of town, a cattle ranch called Donnelly Quarter, which Fletcher Holt mentioned with a peculiar combination of respect and something that lived just next door to envy. Abel Donnelly, Fletcher said, in the tone of someone conveying important civic information, runs about 2,000 head, employs a third of the able-bodied men in this county, best cattleman in the territory if you believe him. A pause. He's not easy. Lavinia would think about that description often in the weeks that followed. Not easy. As a warning, it was remarkably accurate, and as a complete picture of Abel Donnelly, it was almost laughably inadequate. She met him 4 days after her arrival, on a Tuesday morning when she was attempting to take stock of the schoolhouse and its deeply inadequate supply of textbooks. He came in without knocking, which was the first thing she noticed, and he stood in the doorway for a full 3 seconds looking at her as if she were something he had not expected and was not entirely sure he approved of, which was the second thing. He was 30 years old, dark-haired and dark-eyed, with the kind of face that had been shaped by years of outdoor work into something hard and angular, and not conventionally handsome, but impossible to stop looking at. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, with hands that spoke of constant labor. He wore a plain dark coat and practical clothes and no unnecessary ornament of any kind, which told her that he was a man who had decided long ago what mattered and what did not. "You're the new teacher," he said. It was not a question. "Lavinia Boone," she said, and held out her hand. He shook it briefly. His grip was firm but careful, as if he had learned to calibrate the strength in those hands for the situation. "Abel Donnelly." "I know," she said. "The mayor told me." Something shifted at the corners of his eyes, amusement maybe, or something related to it. "What did Fletcher say?" "That you were not easy." He looked at her steadily for a moment. "That's fair," he said, and then he told her why he had come. His ranch employed 11 men, 3 of whom had children between the ages of 6 and 12 who would be attending her school, and he wanted to know her intentions for the curriculum, because the previous teacher had spent the better part of a year on biblical memorization, to the near total exclusion of arithmetic, which was a problem when you were running a cattle operation and needed to trust that the men handling your ledgers could actually add. Lavinia found herself liking him immediately, which surprised her. She had not expected to like anyone in Redemption for quite some time. She had expected to work and keep her head down and rebuild herself slowly, the way you rebuilt a house after a fire, plank by careful plank. She told him her intentions for the curriculum, which were substantial and organized, and he listened without interrupting, which she appreciated, and when she finished he said, "Good," in a tone that was almost warmer than anything else he had said, and then he left. That was how it started, not with drama, not with immediate electricity, though she would later think that the electricity had been there from the first moment. She had simply been too busy surviving her own grief to notice it. It started with practicality, with a man who cared about his workers' children learning arithmetic, and a woman who cared very much about teaching it well. He came back 2 weeks later with a donation of books, a solid stack of McGuffey readers, and a mathematics primer that he had ordered from a supplier in San Antonio without being asked. He set them on her desk and said, "The freight charges were included," in a tone that made it clear he was not looking for thanks, which of course made her want to thank him all the more. "You did not have to do this," she said. "I know," he said, and left again. May settled over Redemption like a warm hand, and the town began to feel, if not like home exactly, then like a place where home might be possible. Lavinia threw herself into her work with the focused energy of someone who needed, desperately, not to think about St. Louis. She was good with the children, genuinely good, with a patience that did not feel performative and an ability to make learning feel like discovery rather than obligation. The parents noticed. The town noticed. Fletcher Holt noticed and took visible credit for hiring her, which she found both irritating and entirely in character. Abel Donnelly's 3 workers' children were named Hector, Rose, and Tommy, and they were respectively 11, 8, and 7 years old. Rose and Tommy were siblings, children of a ranch hand named Diego who had a wife named Maria who brought Lavinia a tin of tamales on the first day of school and cried a little out of gratitude. Hector belonged to a man named Walt, who was less demonstrative but equally grateful. Abel would sometimes come by the schoolhouse at the end of the day, ostensibly to collect the children for the ride back to the ranch. Lavinia suspected, though she could not have said exactly why, that this was not his only reason. He never stayed long. He never said much. But he had a way of lingering in the doorway while she organized her desk for the following day, making observations about things she had written on the board or questions one of the children had asked, in that dry, economical way of his that could cover a remarkable amount of territory in very few words. She told him once, in the middle of May, about a discussion she had sparked that day by asking the older children to write a paragraph about where they imagined themselves in 10 years. Several of the boys had written variations of cattle ranching or banking. Several of the girls had written about being wives and mothers, because that was what they had been shaped to expect. One girl, Lavinia told him, wrote that she wanted to be a doctor. She said it without editorializing, watching his face. He considered this for a moment. What did the other children say? Several of them laughed. And what did you do? I told them that the first woman to earn a medical degree in this country did so in 1849, and that there were currently more than 200 women practicing medicine, and that laughing at a thing does not make it impossible. Something moved through his expression that she could not quite identify, something that looked like respect but also like surprise, as if he had not expected that answer and was recalibrating. How did that land? He asked. Girl who wanted to be a doctor sat up a little straighter, Lavinia said. That was enough. He did not say anything for a moment. Then he said, You're not from here. I came from St. Louis. That's not what I mean. She looked at him. He was leaning against the doorframe with his arms folded and his dark eyes were steady on hers, not invasive, just attentive in that particular way of his that made you feel you were being considered very carefully. No, she said. I know what you mean. They stood in that understanding for a moment, and then he pushed off the doorframe and called for the children, and the moment dissolved into noise and motion, but it stayed with Lavinia after he left, turning over in her thoughts like a smooth stone in a current. She began to watch him the way you watch something you are trying to understand. He was not warm in the way that most people were warm. He did not trade in easy pleasantries or perform friendliness for its own sake. But she noticed that the people who worked for him seemed to trust him with a depth that went beyond employment. She noticed that when old Silas at the livery stable had a bad week, Abel found reasons to bring business there that might not otherwise have come. She noticed that he was the first one at a neighbor's fence when a section went down in a spring storm, and one of the last to leave. She noticed that he was carrying something, the way most people in the West carried something, some weight or history or loss, but his was quieter than most, packed down and sealed, like something stored for a winter that had already passed. She asked him about it directly, one evening in late May when they had somehow ended up walking back from the general store at the same time, her with a parcel of chalk and a few small supplies, him with something from the hardware section that she did not catch the name of. The street was quiet, the sky turning to amber and pink. What happened before, she asked. He looked at her sideways. Before what? Before redemption. You built that ranch into what it is, but you did not start with it. Where did you start? A pause. That is a direct question. I am a direct person. He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then he said, Kansas. My family had land in Kansas. There was a drought in '72. followed by a grasshopper plague in 74 that stripped the region clean. We lost everything that could be lost. My father never recovered from it. He died in 75 of what they called a general decline, which I think was mostly heartbreak with pneumonia to finish the job. I came south with what was left and built what I have now. Lavinia listened without looking at him, keeping her gaze on the road ahead because she sensed that he was speaking more freely without the pressure of eye contact. "I am sorry about your father," she said. "It was a long time ago. That does not always mean much." Another pause, slightly different in quality from the first. "No," he said, "it doesn't." They walked in silence for a little while, and then he said in that same low, measured voice, "What happened in St. Louis?" She was startled enough that she almost stopped walking. She had not expected the reciprocity. She had not expected him to ask. She thought about deflecting. She was still new enough to the town that her past felt like a raw place, something to be protected. But something about the evening, about the quiet between them that was not uncomfortable, about the fact that he had told her something true, made her feel that giving him a deflection would be a kind of insult to whatever this was building between them. "A man," she said. "I was engaged to a man I thought I knew. It turned out the version of him I knew was not the real one. The real version had a hidden motive behind almost everything he had ever done with me." "What was the motive?" "Money. My father's inheritance, which passed to me when he died 3 years ago. It was not a fortune, but it was enough to be attractive to someone whose own finances were a disaster he had kept very well hidden." She paused. The betrayal was not just that he wanted the money. The betrayal was 3 years of performance, 3 years of being seen and known, or believing you were seen and known, and discovering that the seeing was all theater. She heard something change in his breathing, something subtle, and she glanced at him. His jaw was tight, his eyes forward. "That's a particular kind of damage," he said quietly. "Yes," she agreed. "It is." They arrived at the point where their paths diverged, the road to her schoolhouse and the road that ran east toward Donnelly Quarter, and they stopped. The sky was nearly purple now, the first stars beginning their appearance above the dark line of the horizon. "Thank you for telling me," he said. "Thank you for asking," she said. And then, because it felt right and because she was a direct person, she added, "I think you are not as closed as you appear." He looked at her for a moment. "That might be the most unsettling thing anyone has said to me in a long time," he said. And there was something in his voice that was not quite amusement and not quite vulnerability, but was alive with both. She smiled and turned toward her schoolhouse, and behind her she heard his footsteps continue down the road, and she thought that something had shifted between them, some fundamental thing, and she did not know what to do with it. June in Redemption was blazing and golden, and the town had the contained energy of a place where everything was running at full capacity. The cattle drives had started, which meant Abel was often gone for days at a stretch, managing the logistics of moving animals to market with a precision that the whole county acknowledged, even the people who did not particularly care for him, because not everyone did. Some found him cold. Some found his success irritating. Chester Price, Lavinia would later understand, found him a threat. But in June, Chester Price was just a name Lavinia had heard in passing, a man who had arrived in Redemption sometime in the spring claiming to be a cattle buyer from up north, a respectable figure in a decent coat who attended church and kept polite company. The town took him at face value, because that was what towns did with well-dressed men who offered no obvious reason for suspicion. Lavinia's June was consumed by a small crisis that ended up meaning a great deal. One of her students, a 10-year-old boy named James who was the son of a dry goods merchant, began to come to school with marks on him. She noticed them on a Thursday, a bruise along his jawline that he covered with his collar, and the careful, watchful way he moved that children develop when home is not a safe place. She did not make a scene. She kept him after school on the pretense of going over a mathematics problem and sat beside him at his desk and said, very quietly, "James, you do not have to tell me anything, but I want you to know that I am here and that you can." He looked at the desk for a long time. Then he told her. His father, a man who presented himself to the town as an upstanding citizen, had a temper that lived behind closed doors. His mother had been bearing the brunt of it for years. James had started to catch it too. Lavinia spent the evening thinking about what to do. The law in 1878 was not particularly interested in what happened inside a man's home. Marshall Crane was a decent man, but he was also a man of his time, and she knew that going to him directly might accomplish very little and might make things worse for James and his mother. She went to Abel instead. She found him at the ranch the following morning, a Saturday, when the children were not in school, and told him what James had told her. She told him because he was a man whose judgment she had come to trust, and because she thought he might know what could actually be done that would not simply be shuffled aside. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and she could see him thinking, not performing thought but actually doing it, the way he did everything thoroughly and without waste. "There's a woman in town," he said finally. "Mrs. Caldwell. She runs the hotel. She has a sister in San Antonio with a boarding house. If James's mother wanted to leave, there is a path. She would need money," Lavinia said, "to start over." "Yes," he said. He looked at her steadily. "I'll arrange it." She stared at him. "You will just arrange it. If she wants to go, she has to want to go. You cannot do it for her." He paused. "But if she wants to, yes." It took 3 weeks and more careful navigation than Lavinia had ever done in her life, working through Mrs. Caldwell and spending long quiet hours with James's mother, a woman named Eliza, who was frightened in the deep-settled way of someone who has been frightened for a very long time and has started to mistake the fear for reality. But by the end of June, Eliza and James had their tickets to San Antonio and enough money provided, quietly and with no attached conditions, by Abel Donnelly to start again. The morning they left, James came to find Lavinia at the schoolhouse before the stagecoach departed. He stood in the doorway, small and serious, with a look in his eyes that was already beginning to unknot. "Thank you, Miss Boone," he said. "Thank you for trusting me," she said. "That took more courage than you know." After he was gone, she stood in the empty schoolhouse for a long time, and then she sat down at her desk and pressed her hands flat against the wood and breathed, because some things needed to be felt fully before you could move past them. Abel came by that afternoon. He did not say anything about Eliza and James. He did not need to. He sat in one of the students' chairs, which looked too small for him in a way that should have been comical and somehow was not, and said, "How are you doing?" The question hit her harder than she expected. No one had asked her that. Everyone had been focused on Eliza, on James, on the mechanics of the situation, which was right and appropriate, but she had not had anyone turn that question on her. "I am doing," she said carefully. "I think that is the most honest answer." "That's enough," he said. "Doing is enough." She looked at him across the small, sunlit room, at this man who had provided 5 months' worth of rent and travel money to a woman and boy he barely knew, with no announcement and no expectation of anything in return, who was now sitting in a chair built for a 10-year-old to ask her how she was doing, and she felt something move through her that was warm and vast and slightly terrifying. She did not name it yet. She was not ready to name it yet. July arrived with its particular brand of Texas heat, the kind that sat on you like something solid, and with it came a development that neither Lavinia nor Abel had anticipated. A man arrived in Redemption named Wade Sorrell, and Wade Sorrell was connected to Lavinia's past in a way that made her chest lock the moment she saw him stepping off the afternoon stage with her ex-fiancé's name on his lips. Wade was a lawyer, he said, representing the estate of her former fiancé, a man named Charles Fenwick who had died in April of a cardiac event. He presented his credentials to Lavinia in the sitting room of the hotel where she agreed to meet him, and he told her that Charles Fenwick, in a will signed 3 months before his death, had left Lavinia the full sum of her father's inheritance that she had lost in the collapse of his finances, plus interest, plus a letter. She read the letter sitting upright in the hotel chair, Wade Sorrell watching her with a practiced professional neutrality, and the letter told her in Charles Fenwick's careful handwriting that he had known, in the end, what he had done, and that he was sorry, and that he wanted her to have her money back. Not because it would fix anything, because it was right. She sat for a long time after Wade Sorrell left, the letter on her lap. She felt strange, the way you feel after a storm has passed and you are still waiting for the next sound of thunder that does not come. She found Abel at the edge of town near the livery stable in the early evening, and she told him. She told him all of it because they had developed by that point a habit of telling each other things that mattered, and this mattered. He listened the way he always listened, fully and without rushing her. When she finished, he looked out at the horizon for a moment. "How do you feel?" he asked. "I do not know," she said honestly. "I thought I would feel more, justice or relief or something clean, but I mostly feel like I have been handed a letter from a stranger about someone I used to know." "Maybe that's healthy," he said. "Maybe that means you already built something new." She looked at him. The evening light was doing something extraordinary to the sky behind him, all that impossible Texas color, and he was watching her with that steady, careful attention that she had come to feel like a hand at her back, solid and present, not pushing, just there. "I think maybe I have," she said. "Yes." They were standing close enough that she could see the exact angle of his jaw and the way his collar sat open at the throat. And there was something in the air between them that had been building and building for months, that she had been carefully not naming, and she thought that she could not go on not naming it for much longer. He took a breath that was slightly different from his normal breathing, slightly effortful, as if he were deciding something. "Lavinia," he said. "Yes," she said. "I do not know what to do with." He stopped. He looked away briefly at the horizon and then back at her, and something in his expression had shifted, opened slightly in a way she had not seen from him before. "There is something that has been happening for me, for some months now. I am not particularly skilled at this, and I am aware of that, and I am also aware that you came here to build something for yourself, not to be." He stopped again. "I do not know what to do with this feeling," he said. "It is not something I have much practice with." She looked at him, this man who had lost everything and built it back, who was hard in the ways the land had made him hard and tender in the ways he had refused to let it strip from him, who asked her how she was doing and sat in two small chairs and paid for strangers to be safe and watched her across a sunlit schoolroom with those dark, steady eyes. "Neither do I," she said. "But stay anyway." He looked at her for a long moment, something moving through his expression that was too complex and too alive to name, and then he said, very quietly, "All right." That was where it began, the real beginning, the moment with the words out in the open, and everything after that was different in the best possible way, the way the land looks after rain, cleaner and more vivid and smelling of something essential. They began to spend time together in the way that people who have already been spending time together begin to acknowledge that it is intentional. He found reasons to come to the schoolhouse. She found reasons to visit the ranch, which was a working cattle operation with a constant activity that she found herself genuinely interested in, the organization and scale of it, the way he managed the animals and the land and the people with the same economical competence. He showed her things. She asked questions. The questions pleased him in a way he did not always bother to conceal. He kissed her for the first time in early August, on the porch of the schoolhouse after a long evening conversation that had ranged from Kansas to St. Louis to the nature of rebuilding and the question of what a person owed themselves versus what they owed others. He kissed her simply and deliberately, the way he did everything, without flourish and without hesitation once he had decided, and she kissed him back with everything she had been holding for 5 months, and when it ended they stood in the warm dark with their foreheads almost touching, and she said, "I have wanted that for a very long time," and he laughed, actually laughed, the kind she did not often get from him, low and genuine and slightly surprised at itself. August was extraordinary. There was something almost surreal about experiencing happiness in a landscape that had been shaped by such prolonged hardship, the heat and the dust, and the history of loss that ran through the land like a fault line. But there it was, unmistakable and growing. He brought her wildflowers once, held out with slightly awkward formality, and she accepted them with such genuine delight that the awkwardness dissolved. She read to him sometimes in the evenings from whatever book she had at hand, and he would sit and listen with his eyes closed, not sleeping, just present, and she thought there were very few things she had ever done that felt as right as this. The children at the school noticed, which meant their parents noticed, which meant redemption noticed. The attention was mostly warm, occasionally speculative in the way that small towns are, and entirely inevitable. Fletcher Holt made a point of mentioning it to Abel in a civic context that Abel told Lavinia about later with the dry, slightly pained expression he reserved for Fletcher Holt. He suggested it would be very good for the community, Abel said. And what did you tell him? I told him it was none of his business. Diplomatically, she asked. Not especially, she laughed. He watched her laughing, and his expression did the thing it did sometimes, that quiet, helpless quality, as if she had caught him off guard. Stop looking at me like that, she told him. Like what? Like I am something you cannot account for. You're not something I cannot account for, he said. You're something I did not expect. That's different. She reached across and took his hand, and he turned it over and held hers back, and she thought that she had come to redemption to rebuild herself and had somehow, in the process, found something she had not known to look for. And then September came, and with it, Chester Price. Chester had been in redemption since March, but it was September when his secrets began to surface, the way secrets always surface in the end, through the small inconsistencies that accumulate until they can no longer be explained away. It was Marshal Crane who first began to look harder, after a wire from the county seat in response to a routine inquiry came back with information that did not match the story Chester Price had been telling. Chester Price was not a cattle buyer. Chester Price was, according to the wire and the documentation that followed it from 2 counties north, a man with a significant gambling debt and a history of fraudulent schemes, and he had come to redemption because redemption had Abel Donnelly, and Abel Donnelly had land and capital that Chester Price intended to acquire through a land deal that was constructed on false documentation and 3 months' worth of carefully built social credibility. When Abel found out, his reaction was not fury. It was something colder and more measured, and Lavinia found that more unsettling than fury would have been. He's been building toward something specific, Abel told her and Marshal Crane together in the marshal's office on a Thursday evening. This isn't opportunistic. He's been planning it. Someone financed this operation, which means there's more behind him than just Chester Price. Crane agreed. The deal Chester had been inching Abel toward involved a section of Donnelly land that sat over what a geological survey, recently completed and quietly commissioned, had suggested might yield significant mineral wealth. Someone had funded Chester's expenses for 6 months in exchange for a stake in whatever came from the land deal. Who commissioned the survey? Lavinia asked. Both men looked at her. She had said it very quietly, but with the particular focus of someone who had just seen the shape of something. We don't know, Crane said. Then that's what we need to know, she said. Chester Price is the instrument. Someone else is the hand holding him. If you only deal with Chester, the hand will find another instrument. Crane and Abel exchanged a look, the look of 2 men recalibrating. The investigation took 2 weeks, careful and quiet, while Chester Price continued to move through redemption with his decent coat and his plausible manner, unaware that the ground beneath him was dissolving. Lavinia helped where she could, which was more than anyone had expected. She had a gift for spotting inconsistency, honed by years of reading people, and by one very specific experience with a man who had built a performance and hidden a reality behind it. The name that eventually emerged behind Chester Price was a man named Douglas Hale, a property speculator based in San Antonio who had a history of predatory acquisition and who had apparently been tracking Abel's land holdings for some time. The dark past attached to Douglas Hale's name ran through 3 failed communities and 2 families left with nothing, a pattern so consistent it could not be accident. Crane sent a wire to San Antonio. The response confirmed that there were warrants outstanding for Douglas Hale that had been building slowly through multiple jurisdictions, and that there was now sufficient cause for action. The trap was laid, carefully and collaboratively, to catch both Chester and provide the evidence needed to bring Hale to account. It involved a falsified letter of agreement, a witness document that appeared to be Abel signing over a portion of his land, and a meeting arranged for the following evening to finalize the supposed deal. Abel was to be the bait. Lavinia did not sleep the night before. She told him so, sitting in the kitchen of the schoolhouse, hands around a cup of coffee, the lamp making a small, warm globe of light against the October dark. "You do not have to do this," she said. She said it quietly and without expectation because she knew him well enough by now to know that he had made his decision and it was a reasonable one, but she needed to say it. "It's my land," he said, "and my town, and if we don't end it at the root, it comes back." He paused. "Crane will be close. Walt and Diego will be positioned at the stable. It's not reckless." "I know," she said. "I know it's not reckless. I still do not want you to go." He looked at her across the table, and his expression was so open and direct, so stripped of its usual reserve, that it made her breath catch. "I know," he said quietly. "I don't particularly want to go either. That's new information for me." She reached across, and he met her halfway, and they held on for a long moment in the lamplight, and she thought that this was what it felt like to love someone, this specific combination of fear and warmth. This wanting to protect someone from the world while knowing that they had the right to stand in it fully. The following evening went according to plan for approximately 40 minutes. Chester Price arrived at the agreed location, a section of Donnelly land southeast of the ranch house, with the document he had been carrying for weeks. The meeting proceeded, Crane and the others in position, everything moving toward the clean, controlled conclusion they had planned. And then Chester's associate arrived. Not Douglas Hale, who was in San Antonio, but a hired man who had been watching from a distance, who had apparently developed his own suspicion about the setup, because he came in from the west at a full gallop and fired 2 shots into the air as warning, and Chester understood immediately. What happened next was a chaos of motion and shouting and horses, and by the time it resolved, Chester Price had a gun at Abel Donnelly's head, and Abel had his hands raised, and the hired man had disappeared into the dark. Crane was behind Chester, gun drawn but without a clean angle. Walt and Diego were 40 yards away, frozen by the same calculus. One wrong move and a good man died. It was Lavinia, who had been waiting on the edge of the agreed position in direct violation of what everyone had agreed, who heard the shots and ran toward them. She heard herself screaming his name before she was fully aware she was doing it. She stopped when she was 6 feet away because that was as far as reason could carry her, and she stood there with her heart hammering and her eyes on Abel's face, which was turned slightly toward her now, his jaw tight, his eyes saying don't. Chester was watching her with the loose, rattling laugh she had heard before, and his gun hand was steady, and she thought very clearly and without panic that this required something other than what had been planned. "Chester," she said. He looked at her. She could see in his eyes the calculation of a man who had spent 6 months working a long game and was now watching it collapse. "Chester, Douglas Hale has already been arrested." This was not strictly true. He had not been arrested at that moment, but the warrants were active and the San Antonio marshal had confirmed action was imminent, and she was betting that Chester did not know the precise state of affairs. The gun hand wavered, fractionally, but enough. "You're lying," Chester said. "The wire came this morning," she said. "Marshal Crane can confirm it. The man behind you who told you to come here as a buyer is already in custody." Everything you are holding that gun for is already gone." She watched his face. She watched him do the arithmetic of his situation, which was the arithmetic of a man who had been a tool, not a principal, and who had spent 6 months of his life on a scheme that had now folded in every direction simultaneously. The gun came down. Not all the way and not immediately, but it came down by degrees, and Crane moved, and Walt moved, and 30 seconds later Chester Price was face down in the dirt with his hands behind him, and Abel had turned toward Lavinia and crossed the space between them in 3 strides and held her by the arms, and looked at her face with an expression she had never seen from him before, an expression so raw and unguarded that it almost hurt to look at. "What did I tell you about the position?" he said. "You said to stay at the edge," she said. "I stayed at the edge. The edge was 50 yards back. I have a different definition of edge." He looked at her for a long moment, and then he pulled her against him and held her, his arms around her completely, his face in her hair, and she felt him breathe. One long, controlled breath that she understood was the release of everything he had been holding for the past 20 minutes. "I thought," he started and then stopped. "I know," she said. "I know I'm all right, Lavinia. I'm all right, Abel." He held her a little tighter briefly and then released her, and when she looked at his face it was back to its usual composure mostly, except for something around the eyes that was not going to go back to composure quite yet. "You knew he might respond to the news about Hale," he said. "I thought there was a chance. He's not the principal, he's the instrument. Instruments make different decisions than principals when the principal is gone. You were gambling." "Yes," she said. "I was gambling on understanding a person's logic. I thought I read him correctly." He looked at her steadily. "You did." Douglas Hale was arrested in San Antonio 48 hours later, which validated everything Lavinia had said to Chester, including the parts that had been technically premature. Crane got his warrant satisfied. Chester Price was transported to the county seat to await trial. The scheme that had been 6 months in the making came apart cleanly, leaving Donnelly Quarter and its mineral-rich section of land firmly in its rightful owner's hands. The town of Redemption took 3 days to fully process the story, which passed from person to person with all the additions and embellishments that small-town storytelling naturally accumulates, so that by the end of the week, Lavinia had supposedly faced down Chester with a rifle on one account and with her bare hands on another, neither of which was accurate, but which she understood was the town's way of saying something true through exaggerated means. She was sitting on the schoolhouse porch on a Friday evening, the air cool and carrying the first real hint of autumn, when Abel arrived on horseback and dismounted and tied his horse at the post and came up the steps and sat down beside her on the bench, close enough that their shoulders were touching. They sat for a while in the easy, particular silence that had developed between them over 6 months, the kind of silence that is not absence but presence, not emptiness but contentment. "I want to ask you something," he said. She waited. "I want to ask you to stay," he said. "Not as the school teacher, though I hope you would continue to teach because you are very good at it and this town needs you. I want to ask you to stay." As he paused, he was not a man who fumbled words, but he fumbled these slightly, and she found it tender. "I want to ask you to stay with me, formally, permanently, if you'll consider it." She turned to look at him. His profile was sharp against the darkening sky, and his hands were folded on his knees, and he was watching the horizon with the expression of a man who has committed to a direction and is not going to look back. "Are you asking me to marry you, Abel Donnelly?" she said. He turned to look at her then. The expression on his face was complex, full of everything he did not usually let surface, the care and the wanting and the fear and the hope all together. "Yes," he said simply. She thought about what she had been 6 months ago, stepping off a stagecoach in $32 worth of determination and brokenness, rebuilding herself plank by careful plank. She thought about James and Eliza, safe in San Antonio. She thought about a kitchen table and a lamplight and the particular feeling of holding a hand across a table and being held back. She thought about Chester Price and a gun and a moment when the only thing in the world that mattered was the man standing in the middle of it. "Yes," she said. "Obviously, yes." He exhaled, a sound that was relief and warmth, and then he smiled, the real one, the one she had worked hard to earn and valued precisely because it was not given freely. And she reached up and put her hand against his jaw, and he turned his face into it briefly, just briefly, a gesture so small and so complete that it said everything. They were married in December of 1878, in the church with the bell tower that still had no bell, on a clear, cold day when the sky was the specific blue that only belongs to winter in Texas, and the entire town of Redemption seemed to have found a reason to be present. Lavinia wore a dress she had ordered from a dressmaker in San Antonio, a deep blue wool with white at the collar and cuffs, practical and beautiful in the way she preferred things. Abel wore a dark suit she had never seen before and stood at the front of the church with the controlled, serious composure that was so entirely him, which only broke into the real smile when she appeared at the door. Fletcher Holt performed his civic role with great self-satisfaction. Marshall Crane stood in the second row with an expression of genuine warmth. Diego and Maria and their children occupied a full pew, and Maria cried again, this time apparently with pure joy. Walt sat beside them, nodding gravely at intervals, which was his version of exuberance. Old Silas from the livery stable had actually combed his hair for the occasion. The vows they spoke were the traditional words of the time, and Lavinia meant every one of them with a fullness that she had not known the first time she had expected to speak them. Abel spoke them in the steady, deliberate voice he brought to things that mattered, and when it was done and the minister invited him to kiss his bride, he took her face in both hands as if she were something irreplaceable, which she supposed she was, and kissed her in front of all of Redemption in a way that made someone in the back of the church produce a notable whoop, which she later found out had been Walt, who apparently did have a version of exuberance after all. The first year of their marriage was as hard and as good as the West itself. The ranch demanded everything Abel had, and he gave it. Lavinia kept the schoolhouse, because she had been right that the town needed her there, and because she loved it. The children and the work in the daily reminder that the future was being shaped in small, significant ways by what she put in front of young minds every morning. She and Abel had the particular compatibility of two people who understand each other's work and do not ask the other to diminish themselves for the sake of convenience. They argued sometimes. Not often, but with a directness that matched their characters, about real things and never about small things, because neither of them could be bothered with small things. She had strong opinions about the expansion of the school curriculum. He had strong opinions about the county's water rights legislation, which was becoming increasingly important as the region developed. She thought he worked too many consecutive hours without rest. He thought she took on too many additional responsibilities in the community beyond her core obligation. They were both probably right about each other, and they both probably knew it. They were, in the language of the time and the place, making a life. It was not a perfect life, because no life is, and the West in 1879 was still a place of genuine hardship and real uncertainty. But it was honest and it was theirs, and there was a quality to it, a depth and solidity that Lavinia thought came from the fact that they had each built it out of what they had genuinely survived rather than what they had imagined. In the spring of 1880, Lavinia learned she was pregnant. She told Abel on a Sunday morning, standing in the kitchen of the ranch house, which she had slowly, and with a great deal of love transformed from a functional but austere space into something warm and livable. She had made coffee and she handed him his cup, and then she said, "I have something to tell you," and he set down the cup and looked at her and she said, "We are going to have a child." He was still for a moment, the way he got still when something significant had been said. The interior processing stillness that she had learned meant the opposite of indifference. Then he reached across the kitchen table and took her hand, both of them sitting down at the table that had witnessed so many important conversations, and he held it in both of his. "Are you well?" he asked first because that was him, That was always his first question when something happened. "I am very well," she said. "Very well indeed." He looked at her hand in his for a moment, and then at her face, and she saw in his expression the same complex, overwhelmed aliveness that she had seen the night he asked her to stay, amplified. "I did not expect this," he said. "Though I should have, I suppose. I only mean that I am—" He stopped. Then quietly, "I did not know you could want something this much." "Neither did I," she said. "But here we are." He laughed, that genuine, low laugh that she treasured, and raised her hand and pressed his lips to it briefly, a gesture that was both formal and utterly intimate. And she thought that the man who had stood in her schoolroom doorway 18 months ago and looked at her as if she were something he had not expected had become the person she most wanted to be in a room with for the rest of her life. Their son was born in October of 1880 in the bedroom of the ranch house, with the help of the town's doctor and Maria, who held Lavinia's hand with ferocious loyalty for 8 hours and told her firmly and repeatedly that she was doing beautifully. Abel was not in the room, as was the custom of the time, but Lavinia knew he was just outside the door because she could hear him there. The particular quality of his stillness transformed into the particular quality of his waiting, which was a palpable thing. When the doctor opened the door and told him he had a son and his wife was well, she heard him through the wall, a single word, "Thank you," spoken in a voice stripped down to its foundation. They named the boy Thomas Elias Donnelly. Thomas for no reason except that they both liked the sound of it, and Elias for Abel's father, the man who had lost everything in Kansas and died of a grief that had no other name. Abel held his son for the first time with the careful, measured competence that he brought to everything, and then he looked at Lavinia with an expression that was completely unguarded, every wall down, every reserve dissolved, and she thought she had never loved him as completely as she did in that moment. "He is very small," Abel said. "He will grow," Lavinia said. "Everything does," he said, and the simplicity of it, the weight and the hope in those two words made her reach for his hand. Thomas Elias Donnelly grew. He was dark-eyed like his father and stubborn like both of his parents in the particular way that is not stubbornness exactly but conviction. And he spent his early years following Abel around the ranch, with a determined tottering that made the hands smile, and following Lavinia to the schoolhouse on the days she brought him, sitting in a corner with the solemnity of a very small official observer. The years that followed were full in the way that good lives are full, not always easy but consistently meaningful. Redemption grew around them. The bell finally arrived for the church tower in 1881, a donation from a merchant in Dallas who had some connection to Fletcher Holt and was apparently convinced that bell sponsorship was good for business. The sound of it on Sunday mornings became one of Lavinia's markers of home, as specific and reliable as the smell of coffee and the particular way the light came through the kitchen window in the morning. Abel expanded the ranch in 1882, acquiring additional grazing land through a legitimate transaction that he handled with the thoroughness that characterized everything he did, and the expansion brought in additional hands, and with them, additional families and additional children for the school. Lavinia hired an assistant teacher, a young woman named Clara who had come from Kansas with impeccable credentials and a quiet tenacity that Lavinia recognized immediately. In 1883, Lavinia became pregnant again. This time she felt it differently, with the confidence of someone who had done this before and knew what her body was capable of. Abel's response was the same in its core, that reaching across the table and holding her hand and asking first if she was well, and she loved that about him, the consistency of it, the way he was always and most deeply concerned with her. They had a daughter in the summer of 1883, and they named her Ada, for no particular ancestor, but simply because it was strong and clear and suited her from the first moment. Ada was fair where Thomas was dark, with a disposition that was sunny in the specific way of people who are quietly confident, and she attached herself to Thomas with an adoration he initially found annoying and eventually found essential. The community around them had become, genuinely, home. Not the home you are born into and take for granted, but the home you build and choose and know the weight of. Lavinia had arrived in redemption with $32 and a broken engagement, and a determination that had looked to some like courage and felt to her like necessity, and she had built something here that exceeded what she had been brave enough to hope for. There were still hard things. The West did not become less hard simply because you had found happiness in it. There were droughts and there were cattle diseases, and there were years when the market turned, and the margins tightened, and Abel came to bed with the particular silence of a man working a problem that had no clean solution. There were community conflicts and political difficulties, and the ongoing reality of living in a territory where the laws were still catching up to the needs of the people. Lavinia never stopped being direct about injustice when she saw it, which made her beloved by some and uncomfortable for others, and she had never particularly minded being uncomfortable for anyone. She continued to teach. This was non-negotiable, and Abel had always known it, and in fact had never been anything but supportive of it in the practical, undemonstrative way that was more valuable than any amount of performed encouragement. He fixed things in the schoolhouse when they needed fixing. He ensured the supply of materials was never lacking. He showed up at the end-of-year celebrations with the expression of a man attending something he regards as genuinely important. In 1885, Marshal Crane retired and a new marshal came, a young man who was good at his job but needed to learn the town, and Lavinia found herself in the unexpected position of being one of the institutional memories of redemption, a woman who had been there through enough to know what the town was and what it was capable of. She had not come here to put down roots. She had come here to survive, and somewhere in the surviving she had become part of the place. One evening in the fall of 1885, she and Abel sat on the porch of the ranch house after the children were asleep, the way they sometimes did, with the particular quality of quiet that had been their gift from the beginning. The sky over Texas was doing its extraordinary thing, the stars so clear and thick they seemed like something that belonged to a different scale of reality. "Do you remember," she said, "what you said to me that evening in August, the first time you told me?" He knew immediately what she meant. "I said I did not know what to do with this feeling, and I said neither do I, but stay anyway." "Yes," he said. "I have thought about those words a great deal," she said. "The not knowing. I have spent a lot of time in my life wanting to know before I moved, wanting certainty before I committed, and those words were the first time I let myself move without it." He was quiet beside her for a moment, his shoulder warm against hers, looking at the same sky. "I did not know what to do with it," he said. "That was true. I had been careful for a long time, very deliberately careful." "I know," she said. "I watched you be careful. And then you arrived," he said, "and you asked direct questions, and you helped a woman and her son leave a bad situation, and you told me about 3 years of theater, and you looked at me across a schoolroom, and I thought, well, that's done." She laughed. "That's done, the carefulness. I thought, well, that is the end of the carefulness." He paused, "and I was right." She leaned against him, and he put his arm around her, and they sat in the enormous quiet of the Texas night. This man and this woman who had come to each other through loss and distance and a long shared season of building. And she thought that the not knowing had been the thing, the essential, necessary thing. That she had arrived in redemption knowing nothing except that she needed to build a life, and she had found that you could not always know and could not always be ready, and the staying was the act that mattered, the commitment to the present moment in all its uncertainty. She had told him to stay, not knowing what came next. And he had stayed, and she had stayed, and everything that had grown from that staying was here now around them, the ranch and the town and the children and the years and this particular sky. Thomas was 5 and Ada was 2, and they were sleeping inside, and there would be more years. Lavinia felt this with quiet certainty, more seasons and more difficulty, and more of the extraordinary ordinary joy that was the actual texture of a shared life. There would be Thomas growing into himself, with that dark-eyed seriousness that was so specifically his father's, and the directness that was so specifically hers. There would be Ada with her sunny stubbornness, and her inevitable first day of school, and Lavinia could already see the way she would sit in one of those chairs with the official solemnity of a very small person who knows exactly what she is about. There would be another child, as it turned out. Lavinia knew it the way she had known the other times, and she told Abel on a morning in early 1886 at the kitchen table with the coffee between them, and he set his cup down and took her hand and asked if she was well, and she said very well, and he looked at her with that expression she had never stopped finding extraordinary, that complete openness that was so hard-won and so fully given. They named the third child William, for no ancestor but because Abel had always liked the name, and Lavinia agreed it suited whatever was strong and particular about this newest arrival, who came into the world in September of 1886 with what the doctor described as unusual decisiveness, which Lavinia thought was a fine quality to be born with. 3 children, a ranch, a schoolhouse and all the futures being shaped inside it, a town that had grown up around them and that they had grown up in. 7 years from a stagecoach in April to a porch in October, from $32 and a broken past to this specific, irreplaceable life. On the last warm evening of October 1887, Lavinia walked out to find Abel at the fence line that marked the eastern boundary of the property, the section that Chester Price had once been sent to steal. He was standing looking out over the land in the evening light, just standing, which was rare enough for him that she noticed it. She walked out to stand beside him, and he heard her coming and did not turn, just waited, knowing it was her from the sound of her footsteps, which said something about 9 years of paying attention. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. The land stretched out ahead of them, golden in the late light, the grass moving in the wind. "Nothing specific," he said. "Everything in general, the way it all looks." She looked with him, the land, the sky, the long horizon. "It looks like ours," she said. He turned to look at her then, the full weight of that look, and smiled, not the restrained one, the real one. "Yes," he said, "it does." He reached out and she took his hand, and they stood there for a while longer while the light changed, and the evening came on, and behind them, the house held the sounds of 3 children being the specific noise and motion of 3 children. And ahead of them the land was exactly what they had made it, not perfect and not without its history, but earned and chosen and alive. She thought of the evening she had told him to stay. She thought of the long months before it, the careful, accumulating thing, the way understanding had built itself plank by plank out of shared honesty and consistent showing up. She thought of the gun and the terror and running toward rather than away from, because that was who she was, and the way he had held her afterward with his face in her hair. She thought of James and Eliza, safe somewhere in San Antonio, and hoped they were well. She thought of Thomas with his dark eyes, and Ada with her sunny certainty, and William, who had arrived in the world with unusual decisiveness, and was already demonstrating it at every available opportunity. She thought of the man beside her, who had lost everything in Kansas and built it back and was still building, who asked her how she was doing before he asked anything else, who sat in 2 small chairs and gave money to strangers and held wildflowers with slightly awkward formality, who had stood in the light of a Texas evening and told her with his whole honest self that he did not know what to do with this feeling. Neither had she. But they had stayed, and staying had become everything. The years that stretched ahead of them were not visible, but they were present in the way that good futures are present, not certain but probable, not guaranteed but built on a foundation solid enough to hold what they were going to put on it. More seasons, more arguments about things that mattered, more evenings on the porch under that impossible sky. Thomas becoming who he was going to be, Ada becoming who she was going to be, William becoming whoever he had already decided to become in that decisive way of his. The school growing, the ranch growing, redemption growing, the way all things grow when they are tended and chosen and honest about what they need. Abel's hand was warm in hers, and the wind moved through the grass of Donnelly Quarter, and the bell in the church tower on the edge of town rang the 6 o'clock hour, clear and steady, carrying across the evening air. Lavinia Boone Donnelly listened to it and felt, completely and without reservation, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. She squeezed his hand. He squeezed back. They turned together and walked home.